Sweet. If everyone is ready, then without further ado, I'll just start the live stream. And I'll welcome up the first speaker if he's ready to
on my clock app. When people in the Pacific Islands are forced to eat plastic-filled fish and environmental movements are seen as ineffective hippies, we do not stand for the status quo under AF. We think that the environmental movement should prioritize local issues as to make much, much more progress on climate change as a whole and on, the tangible effects on real people today. So what do we see? Not enough progress is being made on environmental issues, both globally and on a local scale. We see that under the status quo, there is so much push to make global change, to reduce CO2 emissions, but these decisions are so hard and so intangible and so large that not enough progress, that governments don't want to make progress and regular people don't want to support these ineffectual hippies, right? Okay, so our solution is to reprioritize so that more good environmental impacts can be immediately seen and the environment movement gains traction. So, two things for you today. Firstly, why the viability of a movement's demands makes governments more climate-minded and makes better decisions. And secondly, why the viability of these demands makes people more climate-minded, and more in support of the climate change movement. So, firstly, why is the viability of demands so important for a government to make climate-minded decisions? So what do we see today? Governments, don't like to make change about climate change, right? We have, student strike for climate. We have the environmental movement. We have the Greens pushing and pushing for climate initiatives, but we see no change being made because these decisions are really, really difficult. They take a lot of money and they take a really large consensus from governments to change, and so change isn't being made. The second reason why this doesn't happen is because these demands don't have tangible effects, right? Climate change is happening. We know because of the science, but we can't see Oriental Bay rising. We can't, if you're in Midwestern America, you're not seeing the effects of climate change right in front of your face. So you're not going to be highly in support of spending billions of dollars on changing it. Governments, even when pressured by environmental movements, because climate change is not climate change is not visible, they're not likely to make legislation and no thank you, to make legislation to change these things because they can't see the benefits right in front of them. If they can't see these effects right in front of them, and these decisions are massive and these decisions are difficult, and we say that governments don't like to make difficult decisions, what is the incentive for them to make change? There is no incentive, right? When a group proposes, as opposed to, under our model, when the environmental movement prioritizes local environmental decisions and proposes something to the government that is going to directly affect their citizens, that is a smaller decision that takes less money but will have more tangible benefits, there's so much more incentive for a government to make change, meaning that we get better outcomes overall for the environment and for the citizens, of the world. Okay, so essentially, we think that even with the small amount of people that are in support of the environmental movement right now, if we as the environmental movement reprioritize, we're already going to see more change towards the environment because of the more tangible benefits and the more tangible outcomes, and because the government's more willing to listen to effectual demands that will have real benefits right now. We already get that, even if no one else is in support of us. But what we also see under our model is that reprioritizing local issues makes it more achievable for more people to be in support of the environmental movement, which overall has much better outcomes. So, second point, right? But before I go on, I'll take a POI.
You've stated that people only care about tangible benefits. Can people not see these tangible benefits through the media?
I actually think that the media are not focused enough on climate change, and I don't think that people are seeing, I don't think that when a cyclone happens, people are going, oh, I should go and buy an electric car. I think people are thinking about the people that are dying because of the cyclone. I don't think that the media actually does much to make the government listen to climate-focused initiatives that don't have any tangible benefits. Okay, second point. No, thank you. More people will believe the environmental movement. So, ineffective hippies, right? what do we see right now? School Strike for Climate is seen as a bunch of woke children who just want a day off school and attention. They do not get the outcomes that they want to see because their demands are always reduce CO2, reduce methane, like change the agriculture industry, right? These outcomes that they want to see are not easy to get. They are not cheap to get, and the government is not willing to make changes because they are not going to directly affect the citizens of New Zealand, if like using New Zealand as an example right now, and therefore the demands like are seen as like, you know, not achievable and too ambitious, etc., etc. So, as the environmental movement is disenfranchised because of the unachievable outcomes, like you never get buy-in from the public on the environmental movement. Like your average parent, your average centrist parent is going, oh, look at those kids at Parliament, like not doing anything, just asking for things that will never happen. You don't get buy-in. Outside of the House, there is so much more buy-in on the environmental movement because people see their waterways being drinkable. Like people can finally shower in the River Ganges without getting a million diseases, right? There are tangible outcomes that affect people in real life as opposed to just like this random number of 2% CO2 levels, right? Okay, you see cleaner beaches in the Philippines near the Pacific Garden Patch. You see the fish that the locals of the Pacific Islands eat not being filled with plastic and being like safe to eat and nutritious to eat. This is viable. This is tangible change, and this means that people will be more people will be in support of the environmental movement, ultimately ending in like better environmental outcomes, instead of just like zero change that comes from constant unachievable demands and these loosey-goosey narratives about like, oh, you know, like everyone should walk everywhere and be a vegan, right? Okay. So what is the impact of more people being in support? So you just have more bodies in support of the movement. This means this looks like bigger protests and just the governments of different countries accepting that actually more people do want change on local environmental issues, right? You have also more positive media because the media isn't going, oh, woke kids, man, look at these greenies, look at these vegans, right? You get more positive media and more people like, oh, the environmental movement actually is making change. We actually do have like edible fish and drinkable water, right? So you get more people in support, and then you get more signatories on petitions, right? You get a more positive mindset around the environmental movement, and ultimately this leads to their change being made and more people being in support of it. So overall, you get more change faster. But it's also a mechanism for like a bigger movement to make these governments listen. Even if you don't buy our first point about governments listening when there are actually going to be tangible outcomes to the demands that the environmental movement has, like even if you don't buy that, what does happen is when more people buy into a movement, the government like is more pressured to make progress on the things that this movement wants, right? Like when you get a wider climate credibility for like the pro-climate movement and the environmental movement, people will back that. Making local change is a pathway for bigger things. People realize the environment is important. Suddenly they're, seeing where this movement is coming from. Like, because people see lobbying to make changes that affect them instead of like these untangible wishy-washy things that they don't believe in. This means that the things that are deprioritized under our side of the mood, like global reduction of CO2 and methane, like bigger changes in systems, actually now have more people behind them. And in the future, we can make more change on this. You know, as well as this, like there's more funding for the own action of the environmental movement. With more people in support, there's easier lobbying. The actions other than pressuring the government, like independent cleanups and aid to communities affected by cyclones and independent conservation efforts, are more tangible, they're more achievable, and the impact is so much larger on our side of the house that we think we already win the debate.
Great, I think the speaker for her speech, and now I'll welcome up the first speaker of the Negating team to open their things.
the first affirmative speaker today has completely failed to look at what these local pushes and this local fight against climate change actually ends up looking like in the real world. Alright, in this speech, I'm going to begin by talking about the characterizations and framing that I think is necessary that our team thinks is necessary for this debate, and then talk about how we see greater action on climate change, and then also about how a local focus is ineffectual due to a mechanism that I talked about there. And then my second speaker will talk about how we actually see greater benefits to the local environment when we focus on global change. All right, to begin with, what are our framing characterizations? So, to begin with, we just thought it was worth outlining what we think the environmental movement's goals are. That to benefit the environment, we think this includes benefiting climate change, because climate change has adverse effects on the environment. When sea levels are rising, we're destroying habitats. When the ocean's getting more acidic, we're destroying habitats, and it's having huge effects on the environment in that way. All right. Second, characterization here is who is actually in the environmental movement? Who is participating in this movement? We think it's richer countries, richer people, Western countries. Sure.
How effective has the climate change movement been to date?
I don't think that's relevant to anything I've said. All right, richer countries have been, we think, are the main people who are interested in this environmental movement, because they have, or people in richer countries, sorry, because they have disposable income, so they're able to take action, and they have stable and secure lives, so they're able to start prioritizing secondary needs, a more stable environment for the future. They're not worrying about being shot by gangs. And then they also have a stronger democracy, so they have an actual mechanism in order to enact change and enact this environmental movement. We think poorer, less developed countries and people in these countries aren't actually interested in climate change because, they aren't taking action against climate change or environment, or for benefiting their environment, because they lack a stable and secure life. They're worried about famine. They're worried about physical security. No, thank you. And they have limited disposable resources. They don't have stable safety nets. They don't have a really strong economy, and so they don't have all of these resources in order to lobby for change and push for change. And also, they possibly have a weak or corrupt government because they're more vulnerable to lobbying from possibly environmentally damaging companies, because they're receiving less income that can propose a huge benefit to them, and they also just have likely have weaker democratic protections. No, thank you. All right, what do we think this global focus actually looks like? We think we're looking at pushing for things like UN treaties. We're looking for international treaties, but also national policy and legislative or regulatory change, and possibly pushing for that on an international stage. All right. We think these policies to be effective because they are able to disincentivize environmentally damaging movements, companies and actions, and they're also able to build the infrastructure to propose alternatives rather than just throwing away this idea without proposing an alternative. All right. So how do we think we see how do we think the negating team, the affirming team, fails to actually look at what this local push, this local focus looks like? All right. So.
On that.
Pardon?
On that.
No, thank you. All right. So a local push for the removal of environmentally harmful businesses. So these businesses have two main options. Before we go into those, just want to clarify that businesses are profit driven. That's our definition of a business. That's what they're interested in. They're interested in increasing profits, for increasing dividends for shareholders, things like that. All right. So what are the two options? These businesses can either adhere to these increased regulations, which is going to be expensive, have expensive initial costs when they have to perhaps buy new equipment. They have to invest in new equipment. No, thank you. And it's also to have an expensive upkeep cost, where maybe they need to pay for increased regulation. They have to pay to have maybe people looking over their equipment and making sure it's all up to standard. And also, we think it's probably likely still harmful to the environment, even if it is diminished. All right, what's the other option? The other option is they move somewhere else which cares less about the environment, has less of an environmental movement. As we told you, as I told you at the start of the speech, this could be a poorer, less developed country where people don't have the kind of luxury to care massively about climate change. All right. or the environmental movement. So this will have an expensive initial cost for this company because they have to shift markets, but it has a much cheaper upkeep for them. They don't have to like put up with these huge like regulations, and also they likely have things like cheaper labor costs because now they're working in a country with like less democratic protections, less people's protections, because they're less developed. And we think this is like that has hugely negative impacts on the environment because there's worse regulations. They're like more able to just like pollute straight into rivers and things like that. There's way worse like just general emissions because they now have the emissions associated with transport to a market. They move from say New Zealand to I don't know somewhere in Southeast Asia. They've now got to go on a ship the whole way to New Zealand. No, thank you. And also, we have way worse emissions because the country has laxer regulations. They don't have to adhere to these regulations, and so now they're able to emit more. No, thank you. All right, we think most environmentally damaging companies and the most environmentally damaging companies have the capital to be able to do this. There's lots of money in industries like in the largest polluting industries like refining, like fossil fuels, like oil. And also there's like an incredibly high entry cost. They have to buy so much equipment. They have to buy like huge like ships, tankers, things like this. And so they're likely to have lots of money. And so they're able to like buy a new factory and relocate because it helps them in the long term. And so, no, thank you. So we think like these hugely damaging industries are able to just move away from regulation, and this is actually more harmful because they like are facing less regulation. And we think people are likely to still buy these products despite the fact that they've moved away because A, they're likely to be cheaper than any alternative because they're being produced in a cheaper market. And there's like likely a lack of other options because the market isn't particularly competitive, especially in things like fossil fuels. And also because we think like we're able to minimize a lot of like the negative public perception through like advertising things as New Zealand owned, American owned, kind of hiding away the fact that all the like the refining is done in Saudi Arabia. Sure.
Do you not think local focus is more important for like poorer countries who have less money and have less ability to impact climate change?
As we told you, we don't actually think people in these in these smaller countries, in these poor countries, don't actually have the ability to enact climate change, enact action against like environmental damages. And so at the end of this first speech, what do we see? So on the affirmative side, we see like all of these huge environmentally damaging businesses being like moved overseas, having huge damages in those countries that they're moving to. Whereas under the negating side of the house, we see like international change. We see international treaties because people are actually like and so like this is able to actually effectively curb climate change. And as my second speaker will go on to talk about, this will also actually help local environments. All right, I quickly want to talk about, I think I missed it, okay, I'll stop there.
Great, I think the speaker for that speech. Now I'll welcome up the second speaker of the Affirming team to continue with this case.
Under the status quo, the environmental movement lacks the support to make any change on issues. On our side of the house, we make tangible benefits to the environment and people's lives. That's why we win today. Two questions for you. Firstly, who makes like more like tangible benefits in terms of like people like on a local scale, and secondly who like improves climate change more, and then but firstly a split on like how like which side like engages people in poorer countries and poorer communities. So we heard like from the Negating team that that like richer people are the ones who can get involved under the status quo, right? We think this is absolutely true. We think that actually we are like way more able to engage people in poorer communities because we, focus on issues that actually tangibly harm, like benefit them, right? We think trying to get someone who is, you know, like dealing with the like in the Philippines, who is dealing with like plastic being burned because that's the only way they can deal, like they can get rid of it, is, you know, significant. Like getting them to be involved in a movement that is actively trying to clean up beaches and remove plastic in sustainable ways is, you know, much easier than trying to like get them involved with carbon sequestration or like, you know, like these issues that like they cannot see the benefits and are not like, no thank you, and are not doing that, right? We think that these people are like actively excluded when the entire focus of the movement is on like, you know, these broad, like, you know, spending billions of dollars and like things that they simply cannot get involved with, compared to like, hey, we are going to clean up beaches and improve waterways, which is something that actively benefits them and that they have the ability to get involved with. So we improve it for these people and improve their engagement with the movement. That's a huge benefit on us of the house. Super happy to support that. Secondly, okay, what does it look like for local issues, right? We told you clearly when like, you know, when we like oceans are like being like contaminated with plastic and like, you know, there are beaches like, and also like water like is like not drinkable and not safe, right? Those are like huge tangible harms to people. We think if we focus on like cleaning up, like if local ish like environmental things focus on cleaning up the ocean, or, you know, being able to like improve the quality of waterways within their country, this actively has huge benefits for those countries, right? We didn't hear much back from them. The only thing that we heard is like, oh, this is not available to people in poor countries. Again, we tell you that actually it's more available than any of the environmental benefits that they're talking about on their side, so we're actually happy to support that, right? Secondly, we heard this thing around how if you like, you know, if you like, you know, force regulations on companies, they're going to like move elsewhere, right? A couple of things against this. Firstly, actually, the main mechanism we told you is like we're talking about like, you know, getting like make like government policy to go out and like improve the environment and also like, you know, like beach cleanups and that kind of thing. We think that all absolutely stands despite what they said. But we actually think that even if like this is the only mechanism for like being able to make progress, we think that it's like we still are able to like, you know, regulate these things. We don't think that every company is just going to get up and leave. And in fact, we think all of this material actually applies more to their side of the house because their side of the house, no thank you, is inherently reliant on, you know, like reducing climate change through like reducing the emissions of these companies. And so they are the ones that are going to be moving, right? When they tell us about like, you know, companies like moving at like overseas, right, to like avoid these regulations, we think that like particularly happens on things with like climate change companies, and so we think that's like where you're going to see most of that. And we actually are going to reduce the capability for these to move overseas because we get buy-in from poorer countries, as we told you, which means that these countries are going to be able to, like, you know, like get more buy-in from their people and are thus like more likely to be making more positive environmental policy, and so thus be able to like make stricter regulations on these companies if they do move overseas, right? But fundamentally, we don't think that this interacts at all with like the fact that literally we are tangibly improving the benefits for the like local people, and so we like, and we think these are like huge benefits. Didn't really get rebutted from the other side, so like that stands. We think like we can win on that alone because of the huge amount of policy, right? So like, so moving on to like what we've heard about climate change, right? We told you like that the Affirming team, the Negating team, like the main like way that they told us that they get more progress on climate change is that like through like UN treaties or like the international things, right? We think to date, these things have historically been unable to achieve any substantive change on climate, on reducing climate emissions, right? Why is this? Because it requires countries to buy into to all collectively buy into a system, right, to like reduce like climate change. We think the incentive for any individual country is to let everyone else deal with the problem and not like make it like, and not like make progress themselves, right? We don't think that this changes anything. So when we actually when we change the focus to local issues, we allow countries to, you know, make this progress because they recognize that it like will have an active improvement on them and like to a degree their voter base, which is like what these countries that like the governments are caring about when they are making these decisions, right? We also we tell you that actually like any progress on climate change is extremely limited because of like all the things we told you, like the effects are intangible, like the harms are not like directly, the benefits of like a climate change policy is not directly beneficial to people, and like there's very high cost like policies for this like low unseeable like reward, which means people are like less likely to buy in. We didn't hear like anything back on this, but we actually go even further than that and tell you that because the environmental movement, like under the status quo, has this like vision of being like able to make any change, you get less buy-in, which means that actually when we are making progress that people can see, like, you know, markedly improving waterways or cleaning up, like reducing the amount like plastic has to be burned in, like in the Philippines, right? We think that people are more likely to buy in, and therefore the movement is going to yeah, I'll take that.
How does doing beach cleanups and burning plastic actually solve the source of the plastic pollution crisis?
Like, firstly, we think like it like reduces like the adverse harms, but we actually think not polluting within the Philippines is like under like not like putting plastic into the oceans in the Philippines is something that would be considered a local environmental issue there. But also we think that we're going to get like just make an improvement like on that just by like but even if we don't, we think beach cleanups are a way we make progress on that. So like happy to support that. But back to climate change, we think that when we make these like progress on these things, people see the movement in a better light as more you know, able to things. People are more likely to get behind it and support it, right? We appeal to now a broader set of people, not just the people that are like focused on climate change, because they're like, we think they're going to like be in support of the movement regardless. But when we focus on like these issues that a much broader people can get behind because it affects like everyone within local communities, affects people, and like it like has a tangible benefit on like the poorer people that we told by need can't currently get into the movement. We like build a broader like set of support, which means that like more progress is going to be made on all aspects of the environment like that the movement is focused on when we that the movement is like dealing with when we focused on you know, the local issues. So what have we told you today, right? We've told you that first, like, we get more progress on local issues, and this is like the most important thing to make because we can make a lot of progress here, and like it directly affects people's lives a lot, right? Secondly, we tell you that actually we give the movement more credibility and allow more people to get involved, which means that we are like able to further the goals of the movement on a more broad sense as well. And because we get more benefits both on our local issues and give the movement credibility to do with all of the goals that it wants to, benefits it wants to do, we like get better impacts for the environment and for the environmental movement. So proud to affirm.
Great, I think the speaker for their speech, and now I'll welcome up the second speaker of the Negating team into the speech space.
We all good? In my debate, I will first begin with my responses to the Affirming team, and then I will move into my point about why, under our side of the motion, we actually see better results for the local environment when environmentalists prioritise global climate change. On this side of the House, we have seen two key points really come through, and that is regarding the tangible benefits, which are what motivates people locally and which will somehow cause greater involvement and greater results for the local environment because people believe these events are tangible. Firstly, I will disprove that people only care about or primarily care about the tangible benefits happening in their local thing, but this will also link back to my other point later on about how we actually see more tangible and more effective results coming from when you have a global focus. And then declined. And then on their side of the House, they've also a big part of that is global climate change action is ineffective. And doesn't actually create change. I will prove this to be untrue and in fact very effective in both helping the local and global environment. On the case of tangible benefits, I've made the point that people are going to be incentivised to help they're going to be better off if they take a local focus, cleaning up plastic pollution in the rivers and the fish in the Pacific Islands. But however, they've failed to recognise that the source of this issue is global rather than local. This plastic is not coming in these small Pacific Island nations from the plastic that produced by them. It's coming from large polluters overseas, the United States, China, around the world. This is plastic that is entering the oceans and then going to them. They're never going to be able to actually clean up all the plastic and when you consider that fish roam around in the ocean eating the plastic as well, and the plastic's still in the ocean, they're still going to have plastic in the thing. So you're not actually seeing these tangible benefits which the affirmative side claims to be happening. Declined. They've also stated that people are only focused in on what's happening in their local environment. We don't see this to be true in our 21st century world. We have a global media, we have a global news. We think people very regularly see disasters happening abroad and sympathise with those people being affected by those disasters. And then also this helps them relate to what could potentially happen to this. This is especially the case when we see things like carbon emissions globally, which are leading to more severe weather events occurring, which affect people locally. Accepted?
Given that local issues can actively get people involved in beach clubs, how does seeing this global thing help people make any progress on climate change?
It helps people because people are able to engage each other on the diplomatic stage and create treaties which, for example, prevent global plastic pollution by creating taxes and tariffs on plastic-produced goods that are able to be enforced by countries tariffing other countries, increasing the price of plastic goods, therefore reducing their consumption. So we see less plastic going in the oceans, declined. And then I'll later move on to how we will actually see more tangible benefits on our side. Now, moving into how they've said that global change is ineffective historically. This is simply not true. An example I would like to bring up is that of the global treaties of the Montreal Protocols, which happened sometime in the 80s, I believe. Countries together as a global community saw the dire issue of the ozone layer, which affects everybody in the world, being depleted and destroyed, declined. Because everybody was able to recognise that this was a significant issue that affects you and me, regardless of where we live locally, they came together and they organised. They discussed a treaty and they found a solution. What they did was, by coming together, people are able to create treaties and regulations that can be enforced, that can be enforced internationally using regulations, tariffs, banning it in their local countries and encouraging others to do the same. By doing this, we actually saw effective change, and because the products that were damaging the ozone layer went out of existence, they stopped being used, and now we see the ozone layer on the recovery. This is all thanks to international cooperation, which is only achievable under our side of the house. When you focus on global climate issues rather than getting caught up in local petty issues, which is not actually going to cause anything. Moving into my points about how we see better results for the local environment when prioritising global climate change. So they've brought up the example of the Ganges River and all the pollution that goes into this. But what they fail to recognise is that for big rivers or other sources, if the source of pollution is actually happening at a place that is outside of your local jurisdiction, how are they actually meant to prevent that issue? They need to cooperate with those countries to actually solve the issue. This looks like going and talking to those people, finding a mutually beneficial agreement, and only then were they actually able to help people. That is why if we focus on global climate change and cooperate together, we're going to see things. Only then we can prevent things like factory pollution in rivers. A key thing that is being failed to recognise by the affirmative team is that we live in a global environment. This means emissions anywhere affect everywhere. This is because, on my first speaker, we've said that, we're seeing if you solely focus on the local regulations, companies move overseas because you're wanting to, example of agriculture, because you're wanting to restrict production, so they go elsewhere because you want to reduce the local impact. But we see this is the case, and in the context of this debate, which is largely happening, decline in the Western the developed world, because those are where people primarily care about climate change the most because they have the means to do so. This is also something that doesn't hold to be true on this side of the case, where they say that in these local environments in developing countries they do care about climate change. This is not true, because as we've proven, when people are struggling to find their next meal, they can't actually do these things like beach cleanups. You know, they're more focused on trying to find a place to sleep for the night, so that's not happening. We see with a local focus, such as in the case of the agriculture industry, if companies are moving overseas and doing things less efficiently because of my first speaker's point about of transport of goods, because that's less efficient, those countries, because they're developing and have less effective governments and regulations, are more likely to not only damage their local environment more, where the harms could be mitigated in a more well-regulated country. It's not actually helping the global environment as well when you see higher emissions, which leads to more severe weather events, which affect everybody's local environment when they occur. And only by that can we actually see positive climate change action when we focus on the global rather than the local. For those reasons, I urge you to support my side of the house and disregard, my side of the house. Thank you.
Great, I think the speaker for his speech. Now I'll welcome up the third speaker of the Affirming to continue the speech.
One fish, two fish, hundreds of grams of plastic in each of these fish. These are the most pernicious harms for communities who have the worst impacts of the local environment. In today's debate, we've seen 2 points of clash. The first being who gets better local environments, the second being who gets better climate change action, because that's like wider than the moot about the two sides. The battle for side F today is we need to prove that local environments get somewhat better at no massive harm to the climate change movement. That's all we need to do to win this debate. We think we've gone way further than this and showed how we massively improved local environments and massively improved climate change action, but that's our burden. So let me start with the first point of clash, who gets better local environments. And generally, we think the winning team will show people are suffering less negative health impacts that we see of litter, banning plastic, eating fish with plastic in it, etc. That's what we think the winning team in this point of clash will look like. So the context we told you is local environmental issues are more direct for communities. You can see the impacts of them. They are cheaper and they are just generally easier to deal with. They're more popular to deal with for governments. The kind of things we've told you right from Teresa and James that they look like, beach cleanups, plastic being burnt, etc. What we tell you is if we focus on these issues, we address these causes and we fundamentally get to the issues facing people, we think we get better local environments. The one main response we heard with this is it doesn't really deal with the source of these problems. Firstly, we think, as we told you at James, there are national ways to prevent litter from getting there in the first place, like promotions to stop Filipino people from littering in the first place that will stop as much litter getting to the more vulnerable communities. But we also see this happening from bigger polluters themselves. If these same movements are occurring in America, who also face issues related to litter, maybe in a less impactful way, we see that will flow on to actually mean there is less litter getting to these smaller, more vulnerable communities. But also, we think on side F that we actually have to deal with the impacts. The causes of litter, the causes of many of these issues are kind of ingrained in society because people purchase goods with plastic wrapping. We think they are going to exist anyway. So we think it is really important, even if it may sound unusual, that we actually have to deal with the impacts because it becomes very difficult to deal with the causes themselves. That is the only viable option. And we see, because we get to like collaborate over a shared goal to stop plastic pollution in the world, we think these countries can collaborate. I'll get more onto how we don't lose collaboration later. We heard another response from Side F about from Side Neg about how smaller countries don't have the financial resources to spend to improve these issues. We firstly tell you that these issues are much cheaper than climate change action. If you compare doing beach cleanups to revolutionising whole farming industries in India, we can see clearly that the beach cleanup's going to be probably cheaper and more accessible. And that is a really exclusive benefit to our side. Instead of making the movement about China, America, and the rest of the developed world, we get to include the environmental movement in these countries who may have less financial resources, get them involved in a way that impacts them, and that is so important and exclusive to our side. As said at your second, we need agreement to fix issues. That was the whole ozone example. And since climate change is such a controversial issue, we've got hippies marching on the streets down Wellington. We think generally litter on beaches is a bad thing, and people can agree and work together. And that's how we get the most efficient progress, as shown by the ozone example. So thank you for that. I will happily accept the PLI now.
How are you actually going to be? How's this actually going to solve the issue when you're only proposing mitigation rather than an actual solution?
Not at all what we're proposing. We think mitigation comes under national local environment solutions anyway. If one of them is to stop litter getting to your streams, so we should not litter as much, that is preventing the cause. But I also told you, as previously, how dealing with the impacts, as unfortunate as it is, seems to be one of the only ways forward in today's debate. So we tell you local environment has the highest weight in today's debate. We've told you so much rhetoric about how people's lives are so perniciously impacted by the harms of local environment, how when plastic gets into people's lungs, this is causing them problems right now. And this is also especially high weight because these people who are suffering this are often more vulnerable in society. They're often the ones with less financial resources to deal with them themselves. Meanwhile, climate change may affect more developed nations like the Netherlands, who have a lot of money to build seawalls. But we also tell you this matters more because it has potential flow-on benefits to the environmental movement as a whole, which will have flow-on benefits to other issues. So we show you we get significantly better local environments, and this flows on to the second point of clash about who gets better climate change action, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. So the context, we tell you that the effectivity of the environmental movement is currently not where we want it. Ultimately, not much change is being made in the status quo that Side Neg stands for. Teresa told you because it's all forms from the perceptions. People cannot agree on climate change action. They may weight economic issues higher, but when you've got something so cheap, so easy to do, and so widely agreed upon in local environmental issues, we think that is much more effective. We tell you also, in the news, how people see a lot of bad stuff on the news daily, that you get inundated with bad news. So people often can't really relate as much to the negative climate change impacts seen on the news because it's not facing their direct communities. People care about the world around them, care about the litter on their beaches. Right. So, two main responses from Side Neg. We firstly had their first Neg point about business, and I think that their point was if businesses will make worse climate decisions because of regulation. But firstly, we don't think regulation is the focus of our case. We've told you from first, this looks like cleaning up beaches, this looks like stopping the plastic problem. We didn't tell you it was regulation. But let's take their Side Neg at their best and pretend it is. Look, because businesses are driven by profits, as you said, we think they are unlikely to make radical decisions that are going to hurt the environment, such as moving overseas, because that is ridiculously expensive. We ultimately think it would be cheaper and more profitable for them to stay in the country. We think this point has probably fallen out of today's debate because it has not come up since from first Neg. So I'll move on to the more relevant response we've had about global, how it's important to get global working. Now I have three responses to how we get better globalization. We firstly still think countries can collaborate in fixing local environmental issues. We often see them as interacting, the same issues that might hurt Fiji also impacts Californian beach coasts, or same droughts that affect Midwest Texas affect Southland, Northland, more rural regions. So we think there is still collaboration, sharing of technologies that can occur. We also think, like, a current flaw in world's globalization is it's just between the most developed countries. It's not between the smaller countries, the Fiji, the Tonga, who are going to be most impacted by climate change. We actually improve our workings with them because we're telling you we care about the issues facing you right now, and we think that's so much more important. And thirdly, we told you that movement has more power when they have proof of fixing issues. And this comes to the last response I'll give you, is that because people can see the effectivity of local environmental actions, they are more willing to get out and then tie in climate action with this, tie in more power, get more people behind it, get more people trying to fix the environment. And that is so strong. We prove that we get better climate action and win today's debate.
What has this debate been about? Well, as the mood says, we're seeing this in the perspective of the environmental movement. Now, what does the environmental movement want? They want overall betterment for the environment. We want to see less pollution. We want to see less global issues. We want to see a better environment. Now, we win this debate, and the negating side is we win. The negating team wins the side of this debate because we have proven you that we'll see an improvement in local and global environments. Now, before I start going on to our side of this debate, I'd like to go over some rebuttal against the affirming team. Now, the affirmative team had run this case where there is simply no incentives to stop global environmental issues from the average person, simply because we're not seeing enough change in our efforts to stop global warming. Now, I'm going to simply say why this is ridiculous. Global warming has since, over time, resulted in typhoons, droughts across the world. If you see your crops dying because you're not receiving enough rainfall due to global warming, is this not an incentive to stop global warming? So this whole case where we're having these people simply not believing anything in global warming, not wanting to trust the government to solve global warming simply because they're not seeing immediate changes is ridiculous. People believe in the facts, and the facts are that global warming is causing issues currently in our present day and time. Now, they also went around saying that they also said that people in poor countries can't. So people in poor countries can't stop companies from illegal dumping. So if you're a person in a poor country, you're going to be more likely to be worried about feeding yourself. You're more likely to be worried about the security of your family. You're not going to be worried about the pollution, global warming. You're going to be worried about living in a country where you don't have basic living requirements. So how do we expect people in these countries to go and start picking up rubbish from beaches? It is simply a ridiculous statement to make, to put these unrealistic expectations onto these people struggling on their day-to-day lives. Now, another thing is said is that, so the environmental movement is making change. Like I said before, we are seeing change because the affirming team is saying they don't want to prioritize global warming. They simply want to focus more on local things. But we're not getting rid of any local. No, thank you. We're not getting rid of any sort of local change. We're still focusing on local environments, just not as much as the affirming team. So we're still going to have, make sure no one's dumping effluent into streams and everything. So, anyways, beach cleanups in the end don't stop the source of the rubbish. We don't stop the source of the oil by cleaning up the oil. No, we figure out where this oil is coming from the oil spills. We figure out where this plastic is coming from that's piling up on the beaches. And the truth is, like we said before with our mechanisms about how we're using offshore, businesses going offshore into these sort of countries, polluting much more, that's where the rubbish is coming from. No, thank you. So how do we stop this source of rubbish? Well, we want to have a sort of global, we want all of our countries sort of unite unanimously to go against these big companies. Now, why would this work? Well, because all the countries can introduce tariffs and carbon credits. Now, these things can make operating overseas in these third world countries more expensive and more difficult, as well as bringing exposure to what these companies are doing. No, thank you. Dissuading people from using these products. So this would mean that under the status quo, we wouldn't see as much offshore operations as we see under the affirming team's world. Now, I'd like to go over our points again. Now, like I said before, we said before, local focus leads to more offshoring. Well, if you have a very well, so let's talk about the world we're current the affirming teams in, right? Most of the Western countries can afford to look after their local environment. They have a lot of disposable income. They're not worried about struggling to feed their population. No, thank you. Struggling to feed their population. They can afford to care about their local environment. But they have disregarded the fact that most of the world are developing nations. These developing nations simply cannot pay attention to these small things. So what we see is when we have a company operating in a Western country, and those Western countries tighten up their regulations, making it more expensive to operate in that country, because the companies want to make more profit, no thank you, they're obviously going to go to the next thing. They're going to go to a developing country and operate there. Maybe worse than they would in the Western country, simply because there's no regulations holding them in place. They can do as much as they want. They can dump things into the waterways. They can offload rubbish into the beaches. They can do whatever they want, simply because these countries can't manage these companies. Now, why is this a bad thing? Well, if you have these countries dropping pollution into the ground and waterways of these countries, we see a worsening of the local environment for the people in these regions. Now, we don't want to see. So overall, when you look at both worlds, you see that in AF's world, you're having an area where these Western countries are having, relatively clean, similar to the levels that we have now, because we still also have, local cleaning initiatives. But then you have these third world countries, no thank you, which are producing most of the world's stuff in very, 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 and with lots of dumping, legal things that happen in Western countries happening in these third world countries. Now, because of this, we're having pollution in these third world countries at a much higher rate than we would have under the status quo. Now, this is a bad thing because we want to see a better environment locally as well. So, if we follow apps, yes, thank you.
How do you how will countries come together to make progress that helps local communities when they're focused only on ineffectual, expensive climate policy?
Well, that's a really ridiculous statement to make. Saying that every country is only focusing on climate change is silly. Plastic affects everyone. It's filling up in the oceans, its oil spills come across the oceans, they destroy our marine life. So saying that these countries are simply going to ignore it to focus just on climate change is just silly to make. Now, let me go back to our points for greater benefits. Now, for CO2 and global warming. Under the negating team status quo, we would see a reduction of global warming if we continue on our current path. Now, why is that the case? Well, if we're having these factories and everything operate in third world countries, no thank you, we're going to see a lot more pollution being released into the air. We're going to have CO2 being pumped into the air with no filtration, nothing, into the atmosphere. And because we all live on the same planet, those emissions will affect us as well, ultimately contributing more CO2 into the atmosphere. Now, this would be a bad thing because we don't want more CO2 in the atmosphere because we don't want to contribute to global warming. So, in the end, we would see the status quo, we would see ultimately overall, over time, a reduction, as our continued efforts, we would see a reduction in global warming. Well, in AF's case, we're simply ignoring all the pollution, sending it overseas, and then seeing them produce all the pollution, ignoring them, and it gets worse and worse and worse. And that is simply why the negating team has won this debate. Thank you very much.
Great, I think the speaker's for his speech now. As is customary, I'm going to reverse the speaking order, so I welcome up the leader of the negating team to give their reply.
I'll begin this reply today by just quickly sense-checking the affirmative team's case. And really look at what they've told us today. They've told us that it is more effective and has better outcomes for our planet to clean up beaches than to enact international treaties, regulatory change, legislative change. And simply, just intuitively, this doesn't seem true. But why is that? Alright, Af's case focuses overly on the symptoms of these problems rather than the actual issues that cause them. We told you this at second and third. And so because they're focusing on things like, cleaning up beaches and are failing to address the underlying pollution that leads to it. They're unable to see effective progress. We told you this at second and third. like the problem just keeps on coming back because they're not actually stopping it at its source. And like this simply because they propose like a mod where they're not actually enacting any regulation. But if we do see regulation, we've told you why you see offshoring, why you see companies moving overseas, and why that's more harmful, and why we don't see that under our side of the house due to things like international bargaining power, tariffs, and like sanctions. And then also like the AFS team, like the AF case, sorry, has like a small finding in the fact that like it pins pollution and all of this on the individual rather than recognizing that like it is large companies that do a lot of this polluting, as we told you all the way through our case from first. How like, you know, this air pollution comes from like large companies and not like, you know, just individual people. And at second and third, we also told you like that these problems are international rather than national and regional. Like, you know, the air pollution in, you know, one country affects the country next to it, and we're unable to actually fix that problem when we're only focusing on local change. Alright, so what have we told you during this debate? Why have we won this debate? We told you that we see benefits to climate change, and like this is inherently beneficial. Like we see like better lives for people, but also how we see like greater benefits for local environments. We told you this for second and third. And so like really like the big thing here was just like we see an overlap in like the problems. They're problems that face like the global climate change are also problems that face individual communities. You know, things like air pollution and like habitat destruction also affects climate change, and it also affects local communities. And through that, we see benefits for the local community. And so like when we're seeing both benefits for global climate change and benefits for local communities, we've clearly won this debate because the AF has like failed to actually address the problems that face the world, the problems that lead to pollution, the problems that lead to climate change. Thank you.
Great. I think the speaker for their speech, and I'll welcome up
Sorry, guys. I'd like to run a sense check on the negating case. I would like to remind everybody that the moot says that the negating team must be arguing for prioritizing global climate change action rather than prioritizing like mitigating the harms of like the source of oil pollution. That oil pollution is a local environmental impact, and it is what we stand against, and it does not ruin the ozone layer. It does not rise CO2 levels. And the fact that the negating team tries to argue that they will stop pollution at the source, that they will like lower CO2 levels, that they will have good benefits is absolutely absurd, considering they argue for the status quo where there are like initiatives to have global treaties against climate change, where there are initiatives to like have tariffs on oil companies, that they argue for the status quo, but what is not happening at the moment is change for the environment, and prioritizing local issues provides a mechanism for us to start that change, because we must start at the bottom to get to the top. So first point in this debate, global progress, right? So our case was essentially that there is not currently an incentive for governments to listen to environmental movements. We as the environmental movements want as much possible benefit to the environment and to local and to communities like as possible, and currently the as possible part is very, very small, and on our side we argue for a change in our priorities so that we can make as much benefit as possible. Because while we agree with the negating team on the point that like maybe it would be good if all the countries in the world just stopped emitting, we don't think it's like we just don't think it's realistic. We'd like to run a sense check. We don't think that under the status quo, anything is happening to an extent where it's actually affecting these poor communities that they focus so much on, and where it's actually affecting these oil spills in the ocean. Our case is that Currently, the environmental movement's demands for global action are unreachable, they're vague, they're untangible, and therefore governments do not listen, and governments will not make the changes necessary. As opposed to under our side, where our goals are actually tangible, they're helping communities, they're making rivers, they're making water drinkable and seafood edible, which leads to like more people picking up on the climate change movement, more people being in support of it, and therefore more and more change to get to the point where we can have global treaties that actually work, where the US doesn't back out of them, where governments don't go, I'll leave it to everyone else. They can just deal with it. Like, we don't understand how global progress can be made without starting at a local point. Okay, we actually think that in order to make climate progress, like the environmental movement must appeal to governments and must appeal to the public. And it doesn't do this under the negating side. To appeal to the government, you must have like a specific outcome that you want to reach. You must have like a realistic number of dollars that it will take, and you must have a lot of people behind you. The negating team gets none of those things. To appeal to the people, you must not be a bunch of woke kids. You must not be a bunch of vegans. You must have tangible benefits for the people that you're trying to appeal to, so that they will sign your petitions, so that they will fund you, so that the media will give you so that the media will view you positively. So, we heard from the negating team that tariffs and treaties will make a flow-on effect to positively benefit communities, right? They said that they'll stop things at the source. But what they failed to recognize are our two responses to this. A, companies are actually not affected to their side because they are oil spilling and dumping, which does not ruin the ozone layer, which does not rise temperatures, which is what the negating team must prove gets better to win this debate, and which they have not proven. The point is, countries with enough incentive, so enough push from the people, which is what we get, might actually want to put legislations in place to stop oil spilling and to stop rubbish dumping. That actually might happen under our side of the house, as opposed to the status quo, which the negating team argues, which does not work because there is not enough incentive for people to listen or for the government to listen. Thank you.
Great, I think the speaker for his speech, and I want to thank all the speakers for what was a really interesting debate. I invite you guys to cross the floor and shake hands, and I invite everyone else to leave and allow the judges to deliberate. Let's go.